I won't say chaotic, but it was a little odd because we had the problem with the equipment, and I hope the problem in here is fixed. It seems like the problem in lab has been fixed, so hopefully you won't run into the difficulties that we were over the last week. At any rate, what I want to do is I want to draw on the board what we did and talk about it. And we're sort of like doing this backwards, right? Because usually I do this kind of lecture before we talk about something, but now I'm going to do it after we talked about it. But I just want to point a sketch of what we're doing and talk about what the new thing was that we had covered and the different things. Because it's always good, I say this in all of my classes, when you have a new challenge, and this doesn't just apply to students, it applies to anyone, but when you have a programming problem, to sort of take inventory and say, yeah, this part of the problem I've done 1,000,000 times, all right? So I'm pretty sure I know how to do it. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't going to be a curveball that like, oh, gee, I didn't think about that. But for the most part, you think, okay, this part of the problem I've done a bunch of times. I think I can handle it. This part of the problem, I haven't done anything like it, but I've done things similar to it. So I'll bet I'll be able to do things a little differently and just tweak stuff that I've done before and come up with a solution to a newish part of the problem. So it's not like brand new, it's not like something you've never seen before, but you haven't done exactly that, all right? And then finally there's the stuff that you just like have never done at all before. Like, I have no idea how to do that. And of course that's the hardest part, you know, and that's the part that you can figure out. But when you take inventory of those things, you know, it kind of helps you with the strategy. You know, you can start off working on the stuff that you're confident in and at least get the ball rolling, and then you can look at the other things, and then finally you can go and do the part that you don't know. It's good for you as a student, I think, to take that approach. It's good for me as a teacher. A lot of times people come up to me and say, I have no idea how to do this problem. And I think what they're really saying is that there are parts of this problem I have no idea how to do. All right? Because it's pretty rare for students, once I sit down and talk with them, it's pretty rare for students like to not have any idea about any of the problem. So they might have a good idea about half the problem, and maybe half the problem they have no clue about. But literally to not have any clue about any part of the problem is actually pretty rare. So you do the part that you can. Sometimes that will lead you in the direction to the part that you don't know how to do, and other times, well, that's where you need the extra assistance to get over that bump in the road. All right? At any rate, what we had last time, and this is a pretty common thing, I mean, think of like a search on Amazon. This is sort of the same idea of it. We had a page that had a search. All right? And that search gave us a list of things. I think it was a list of courses. All right? And then we wanted the course ID to be a link. So that when you clicked on it, it took you over to a page that showed you more detail about that course. So in our case, we have all the course information and all the section information. The section information is a grid view. I'm sorry, the section information is a grid view. The course information is a details view. So let's review this and let's kind of talk about, we've already gone over this whole problem, so let's break it down and talk about the newish parts of it and the old parts. All right. For a few classes, we've been doing parameterized queries. What's a parameterized query? Here, we're pulling all the courses that match a certain string here. So we type in database. If it has database anywhere in the title, it will appear. So for this, we're going to have a SQL data source. and a grid view, because we could have more than one course, right? The two view controls that we're going to look at initially are going to be the details view and the grid view. Later on in the course, we'll study other views, all right? But for now, until a few weeks from now, if I say the query is going to return many things, think grid view. If I say it's going to return one thing, think details view. So this query, there could be more than one course that matches the name that I type in here, so it's going to be a grid view. So one data source, one grid. These two are bound together. The SQL statement for this is going to be something like select star from course where course name. I forget the fields in the database, so bear with me. Like so what does that mean? The percent sign is the wild card. All right? The question mark is the parameter. Whenever we have a parameter in a SQL statement, we're saying we're going to fill in the exact value of that parameter at runtime. So we don't know what the person's going to search for. They're not always searching for data. They might be searching for accounting or nursing or art or whatever. All right? So whatever they put in the search, we're going to plug in here. So what we have to do for these parameterized queries is tell the object where you're getting your value from. And in one of the cases, in the simplest case, in the case that we've done a few times in class, you're getting that parameter from a control on the page. You're getting it from a text box, you're getting it from a drop-down maybe. All right? There's no SQL data source for this, right? Because that's a free-form field that people are just going to type in. It's not like we're retrieving anything in the database for this. We're just allowing people to type in there. So we're going to have grid view, SQL data source. The select's going to look like this. And we have to bind the data source to the grid. And we have to bind this parameter to the name on the text box. That's stuff that we've done for a while. All right. This being a link is new. We just did that last week for the first time. And we can define a link field in our grid view. We can say we're going to have a link. And when we create a link, usually that link is going to be part hard-coded and part data filled in. All right? So, and we're going to pass the ID from this page to this page using the query string. Remember, the query string is one way that you can pass data between web pages. All right? So, our link is going to be part hard-coded and part filled in from the data source. So, our URL is going to look something like this. Details.aspx $ID equals and then curly bracket 0. And what that represents is, where you see this is a field that's going to get filled in with a value from the database. And immediately above it, we put in the field from the database that we're going to fill in that field with. So each one of these links is going to be different. The first part is all going to be the same. Detail ASPX $ID equals. And then the actual value for the ID is going to get pulled for that row's ID in the database. Now, we're going to pass the ID on the database because that's how you uniquely identify something in a relational database is with the primary key, right? That's how you uniquely identify something. I can't pass the number of credit hours, right? Because a bunch of courses have 3 credit hours. I can't pass a department because there's a bunch of courses per department. Really, the only thing that we know for sure that is going to be unique is a primary key. Primary key is what we decided is the best thing to uniquely identify it. So even if there are other alternatives, we're going to use a primary key. So we're going to pass whatever the primary key of this table is here. So when this gets called, it's going to look like this. Detail, ASPX, question mark, ID equals, and let's say for this row, the value is 5. So now, we want to pull up, and we want to populate these two things for course with an ID of 5. Now, when I specified the name ID, I could have picked anything, right? It doesn't matter what I call it, as long as I call it the same place on this page, same thing on this page and on this page. I could have called it Charlie equals 5, right? Or, whatever. But I pick ID because that's something that's pretty obvious. I guess what I'm saying is it doesn't have to be the name of the field in the database. All right? I could use the word key. PK for primary key. Whatever. Doesn't matter as long as on page 1 and page 2, we know the name. Right? And we are consistent with where we put it and where we pull it off of. So now on this page, what we're going to have is we're going to have 2 SQL data sources. And a details view, because the header part is only going to have one value. There's only one course that's going to match this course ID. But there could be multiple sections. So we are going to have a grid view here. Now, both of these SQL statements are going to have select statements. Select something from something where course ID equals question mark. It's kind of the same kind of thing we did here. The only difference is, in this case, we're not getting the question mark from a control on the page. We're getting the question mark from the query string value called ID. One thing that's important to determine is if you're going to have, how many data sources you're going to have. And again, the way I go about this, the way I think it's best to do it, is simply describe where the data is coming from in words. And if it's the same thing, then it's the same data source. If it's different things, then it's different data sources. Like if I was going to describe this thing, I'd say, well, this is the information from the course table about the course on the query string. This is a list of sections. So right then with that explanation, this is one course from the course table. This is a bunch of sections. I know that there's 2 separate data sources. Yes?
So the section part's sort of like a subsection of a form?
Yeah, exactly. This would be like an access, this would be like a subform. A lot of times I call this like header and detail. Like, again, that pops up all kinds of times on web pages. You have an order header that is Mike Zeller's that placed the order, I live at blah, 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 my address, and then here's a list of the items I ordered. So you'll see that a lot. All right. Here's a basketball team, here's their roster. So you have the information about that and then a list of all the things related to it. So yeah, you could consider that like an access, that would be a subform for it. But the idea is that there's going to be 2 separate data sources. Because if you verbally describe them, they are different things. This is the list of the one course that matches this ID. I know it's going to be one course by definition, right? Because I'm passing the primary key. So at most, it's going to return one course. This one could potentially be multiple. So therefore, this is a list of all the sections. So it could be many here. There's only going to be one here. So there's different data sources. Questions about that? All right, let's look at at the actual code for this. I still, on occasion, have students that open the file incorrectly. Go to File, Open, Website. Pick the folder that has app data in it. Also has the web config. And go to Solution Explorer. I'm going to make the home page my default page because I was clever this semester and created a master page that I could put links to everything on. All right, so I don't have to go and worry about like what the page is called or anything. I just follow the links. All right, so here is what we just talked about in action. Maybe? Okay, here we go. All right, I'm going to go to Course Search. That brings up that first page with the text box and search button. So I type in something and hit search. It shows me a list of the courses that match that. All right? So we can imagine what this looked like. The select statement was select course ID, course name, credit hours from course, where course name like %, plus question mark, plus %. I then click to this. If I notice each of these links, you can see way down in the corner, or we can view source if you want. These links have added on to the end of them the ID. This one has an ID of 1. This one has an ID of 2. All right? So our link is the same up to the equal sign. Because we're always going to call that second page as course details, because that's the name of it. But what we have to pass is we have to pass the ID over to the second page. All right? So in other words, there only needs to be one course page, one course details page, right? And it'll handle however many courses we have, just as long as we pass it the ID correctly. So now I can go and click on this. And again, here's our details view. Here's our grid view that shows us the one course that matches it and the list of all the sections that match it. one course, the mini sections. Now, if I remember last time, we didn't have tons of time to style this, make it look nice. We can spend a little bit of time doing that now if you want. All right. But this is the basic data access. So let's look at the ASP.NET code. Then we'll spend at least a little time worrying about the appearance. Again, this is primarily a coding class, right? Programming. But yet, creating web pages that look complete and look completely styled is important. So I don't want you simply to turn in assignments that look like my examples. All right, my examples are typically bare bone because I'm focusing on that part of it. But for your assignments, I want you to do that part of it and also do the styling, the dot in the I's and cross the T's, and so on. Okay, let's look at the course search page. Nice thing about this is we have no C# coding. Isn't that great? All right. It is worthwhile for you to look at the ASPX code. Don't rely on simply going through the visual mode. All right. I say that all the time. So spend at least some time looking at this because sometimes there's things that are very easy to correct in the source that are very difficult to correct in design mode. And some things are easier to do in design mode. So if you're good at both of them, then you can switch between them and work the best way possible. All right. So if we look at this, nothing really to speak of in that text box or the button. If we look here, let's start with the SQL data source. And we didn't fix this lab today, I don't think. Well, I'll tell you what. We'll try to do this just by looking at the code view. Practice what I preach. Give me a second to send a nasty email. Repeat that, please.
I was wondering if everybody got that fixed on their computer at home because I couldn't get mine fixed despite adding that engine.
Okay, this is two different problems.
Okay.
The engine is handling the one error. For this, I think there's like the newest patch or the newest update to it. You have to download an error. Because really, the only difference between the design view and the code view is the design view writes the code for you by you simply dragging stuff around. Right? So it's not like there's 2 pages. I always have trouble with my students or I have trouble with some of my students in CISS243. They almost think that there's like 2 files. The file that they see in the browser and the file when they're editing it in Notepad, all right, or Notepad++. It's like, no, it's just 2 different ways of looking at the same file. So, course search. I can go in and I can set parameters by clicking on the thing and set parameters of the grid view or the SQL data source or whatever. I can also go and look at the code here. So let's look at the code for the SQL data source. SQL data source, all this is what you'd expect. Connect string is this, the college DB connection string. Provider is the provider name from the connection string. Then we have the select command. I will say sometimes it's a little hard to read just the way that it formats the code, but the select command is just as I described. Select course ID, course number, course name, course credit hours from course, while course name, where course name like. Hi. Course name like %, question mark, %. Order by course name. So there's a SQL statement. The select parameter, right, is what? It's where we're getting the value from to put in that question mark. And where are we getting it from? Well, we're getting it from a control, all right? We're not getting it from the query string. If we were to look at this on the second page, we'd see query string here, or query parameter. The name of the control ID is the name of the text box. The name of the parameter is simply question mark. And the value we're pulling is we're pulling the text. So we're pulling the text from the text box and putting it in that question mark right here. So we can see everything that we want to from the source view. We can also see details about the grid view. All right, here's the grid view. Has 3 columns. A bound field is simply pulling it from the database query. The header text, the sort expression, if we want to enable sorting on the grid view. So I can change the header text to be maybe the word hours written out completely. Course name. The data field is the name of the field in the database that you're pulling out. Now, the hyperlink field, notice we have some additional properties. We have data navigate URL fields. We could put more than one. We only need to put the one, the course ID. So that's why it says course ID. The data navigate URL format string says where do we put that field? And we put it, and we substitute the curly bracket 0 for, we put the course ID in there. And then finally, the text field is going to come from the database field called course number. So you see, you can get all the information from the source view, or you could get it from the design view. I'm not going to configure the data source because we know that's a problem, but I am going to edit the columns, and I can see that here with the hyperlink field, the data navigate URL fields. That's a list of the fields that we need to pass on the query string. We only have one, the course ID. Data navigate URL format. This is where we mix. Part is everything up to the curly brackets, and the curly bracket 0 simply means the first field on this list, because we could actually pass more than one field on the query string if we wanted to. And then finally, what's the text of the link? What do they click on? That's going to be the text field. Okay. So, when we run this, we essentially get what we asked for. If we do a course search. And if we look here, the URL at the end of the URL contains the ID. So any SQL statement that you write for something like this should include the primary key of the table that you're selecting. That's a good thing just to make a rule. If you're selecting something from a database, include the primary key. Because you might need it for passing around or something like that. Okay? Even if you're not going to display it. How do you not display something? Well, you can go in to the grid view and simply say, okay, I don't want to display that, and click the X and get rid of it. But it's good to have the ID because you might need it to pass to another page. Even if you don't need it now, you might need it later. I lied. I'm not going to spend too much time worrying about styling this. You can work on that. And we talked a little bit about how you can do that sort of thing. All right, it's not really that hard. Just to reiterate, though, what I've talked about before, what you need to do is you need to know the HTML that gets generated. So if you do view source, you can see that this grid view is a table. And you can put rules on the table to get rid of stuff and the style stuff. That course name is a TH, so is the credit hours. So if you want to change these, you'd put a style rule for a TH, and so on down the line. All right, let's look at page 2. Page 2, of course, when we click on a given course, we go and we see details about that course, and we see a list of all the sections for it. All right? So, let's look at that page in more detail. Notice we have 2 data sources and 2 visual controls. All right. We have a details view called details view course, and we have a grid view called grid view sections. Because this is going to show the one course, this is going to show the multiple sections. Again, because just the way that we verbally describe that as 2 different things, we know that we have 2 different data sources. All right. One of them is the one course that matches the ID. The other is a list of sections that match the ID. So it sounds like it's 2 different things, so it's 2 different things. I'm not going to try to configure these because we know that Visual Studio, I almost said a bad word, can't handle that today. It's being difficult to work with. All right, but if we look at it, we can see. Here's one of our data sources, SQL data source. The select statement is select star from course where course ID equals question mark. Where does that question mark get filled in? It gets filled in from a different place. It doesn't get filled in from the control. It gets filled in from the query string. And what's the name of the field on the query string? All right, that's ID. Now remember, that has to match the field that we put it on the query string. So to pull it off that field, we have to put it on that field. So this field ID has to match with what we did and where we put it on the query string. So we called an ID on the query string when we put it there, so we have to call it ID when we pull it off of there. So that's our course SQL data source. They'll pull the one course whose ID matches the ID that we pass. The data source for the sections, same thing, same connection string, same provider name. Select command is going to be a little more involved. We're doing a join between the two tables where section.course ID equals question mark. And we order by faculty last name. Where does that question mark get filled in from? It also gets filled in from the query string. Yep, the question mark gets filled in from the query string. And what is it called? It's called ID on the query string. Our details view and grid view are essentially the same. We just have to bind the right one to the right one. We have to bind the grid view to the SQL data source 2, and we have to bind the details view to SQL's data source 1. And again, we could style these to look however we wanted them to. All right. Now, by default, this is how details views work, and this is how grid views work. They show up in tables and so on. Questions over any of this? Okay. Now, generally speaking, when we have a coding problem to handle, one of three different scenarios is going to be the case. This is sort of specific to ASP.NET, but it's kind of true whenever you have a framework that you're dealing with. Part in that example, we used controls from the framework and didn't do a lot of playing around with them, right? We tweaked a couple parameters, we did this, that, and the other, but we really didn't do a lot of customizing those controls. We just set a couple properties. That's sort of scenario one. Framework has controls whose default behavior produces desired results with minimal fuss. All right? That's the scenario I would describe right now. That there was the controls that exist in ASP.NET Framework, did pretty much what we wanted to do, and we didn't have to do a lot of work. Notice, and if you remember going back I showed you, notice that there was no C# code whatsoever. So all we had to do is tweak some properties. And that's good. This we could call the happy, lazy programmer scenario. To get what you want without doing a lot of work, that's what all of us want in every aspect of our life, right? And it's true for programming as well. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen all the time. All right? So the second scenario is controls default behaviors sort of do what we want, but needs moderate to a lot of work to get desired results. All right, we'll see examples later on where we have a little bit different requirements, where our grid view and our details view will take us most of the way there. Will take us 70% of the there, or 80% of the way there. But we still have to put some work in to get it to do exactly what we want it to do. All right? We're not quite as happy as here, because we have to do more work. All right? But at least it gave us a head start. So if I was going to say, you know, maybe this is the default behavior of the controls do 95% of what we want it to do. And we forget about the extra 5%. Or maybe it does 100% of what we want it to do. And we're really happy. In this case, the default behaviors do kind of what we want, but we have to spend some work. So maybe it does 70%. Maybe it does 50%. Maybe it only does 40%. But you know what? If you can find someone or something that can decrease my workload by even 40%, I'd be thrilled, right? They even decrease it by 20%, I'm liable to be happy. All right? So, this isn't as good as this, but, okay, still the framework worked for us. Now, the final step is where we do it ourselves. Now, advantage of that is we can make it 100% exactly the way we want it to do it. All right. The disadvantage is it's going to be a lot more work because we're not going to be using the other components to the degree that we were in the first two. So if we go down that list, these things move in opposite directions. The less work the components do, the more work we're going to have to do. The components do a lot of the work, we don't have to do a lot of the work. All right? You have this challenge pretty much anytime you work with a framework, right? If the components and if the default behavior in the framework does what it wants, does what you want, then, hey, that's great. You don't have to do a lot of work. But if they don't, then you sort of have to decide, do I tweak those components? Do I bail out and write my own code to do something? All right? That's your choices. All right? And these things move in opposite directions. The more work that that you have to do, the less work the components are going to do. So what we've looked at so far have been using the components sort of right out of the box, using their default behavior, and it did pretty much what we wanted to do. Of course, we didn't have really high aims, right? We just wanted to pull some data up on our pages. We didn't want to do a lot with it. So, the default compose can do that. Now let's look at a different scenario where we have to write a little bit of code of our own. And There's probably a bunch of ways to do it, but I want to go over this example because this is more along the lines of sort of this area of the chart, where we're still going to use the components, but we're going to write some code of our own. And we're going to do that for a login. All right? Can you imagine what a login would look like? A login would look like this. And I know there's some components in ASP.NET that help us with this, but we're going to write our own login. We have a screen. We're going to have user ID, password, and a button. All right, to log in. How do we know if someone successfully logged in or not? It validates it. Go ahead.
User ID and password matches something in the database.
Exactly. We validate it and make sure that the user ID and password match something in a database. What's our database table going to look like? So we're going to have a user table. What's our user table going to look like? Okay, user ID. And what else? Username. And what else? Password. Okay, we're going to at least have something like this, right? And in this case, we're going to have them key in their username. Maybe we're going to have another field for full name. All right. This I'm going to make an auto number field. This I'm going to make a text field. And I'm going to make a unique index out of it. All right. Why am I going to do that? Because chances are you're not going to remember, users aren't going to remember like some number. They're going to remember like I'm M Zellers or ML Zellers or whatever. So this is what I'm going to store internally as a key to this table. Because I'm going to use that when I create relationships for this table. All right, when I place an order, I don't want to put the full user name in as a foreign key. I just want to put in the integer user ID. So I'm going to make this a primary key. I'm going to make this a unique index. Another way of saying it is this is a candidate key. Password is going to be text. And full name is going to be text as well. So what do you suppose our select statement should look like? We do this a couple different ways. How do we know if someone has logged in correctly? Because I want to build a select statement that tells me if they've logged in correctly or not.
Aware that matches either ID or name with what's in the password.
Exactly. So something like this we could do. Select star from users where I'm going to use username, where username equals question mark and password equals question mark. Can we use two parameters? Yeah, sure. Two question marks. We'll have to explain where both of them come from. But in a nutshell, this one's going to come from here. This one's going to come from here. How do we know that they've logged in successfully? What's going to be our test if they've logged in successfully?
The button on click with some kind of code.
Okay. We'll have code in the onClick button event that will look to see if they've logged in correctly. That's absolutely right. What's the result of that select statement going to be? How many rows is that select statement going to return? Pardon me? Well, it's not going to return all the users, right? It's going to return, and how many of them are there going to be? There's only going to be one, right? Because if username is unique, that means there's only one mzellers. So all of them is one, all right? All of them is one. What if I type in a correct user ID but a wrong password? How many rows is it going to return? None, right? Because our condition is select star from users where username equals that and password equals that. So if I type in the right username but the wrong password, it's not going to return any values from the table. What if I type in a wrong username but a correct password? Well, if I type in mzeller, and I forget the S on the end of my name, but I type in my right password, how many people is it going to return? How many rows is it going to return? 0. What if I get both of them right? How many is it going to return? Exactly 1. What if I don't get anything right? I'm just trying to log on, and I just hit my keyboard. Well, I'm also going to get 0. So I have two alternatives here, all right? Two things I'm going to need to test for. One is I'm going to need to test if both of them match, and that will return 1 row in the query rather. So this query is either going to return 1 row or 0 rows. That's really our only two choices. So that's kind of cool, right? 1 row or 0 rows, which means that if 1 row is returned, then we have a successful login. If 0 rows are returned, then we have an unsuccessful login. Okay? Do I have to have a grid view or a details view to go along with this? Right? In my search before, I had a grid view and a detail view, and because when I searched for a course, I wanted to display the course. Do I want to display the results of this query? No. So this is a little bit different situation than we've had before. We could probably do some of it the same way, but we're going to do some of it a different way. All right? So we're still going to have all the objects, or most of the objects that we saw before. There's still a connection to the database. There's still going to be a SQL data set. All right? There's going to be parameters. All the things that we had in the previous example are going to be there, but what's not going to be there is a detail view or a grid view, because we don't need to display this on the screen. We just need to check to see whether something was retrieved or not. Now, that's not the default way that these things work, for the most part, right? So that's why we're not going to be using the default behavior of these guys. We're going to be in our own territory, all right, where we write some of the code. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the same objects, or many of the same objects that we used in the previous example, except we're going to create them in our code as opposed to just dragging them and dropping them on the page and letting the default behaviors do their thing. Okay? So this code is tricky. I never remember it completely, so I have a finished version that I'm going to copy and paste from. I consider this like the equivalent of chefs on TV when they're cooking a turkey or something, and they have a completed turkey in the oven that they just can pull out at the end of the show and show you that. All right. So I don't have to go through every single step and type it because, as you know, I'm the world's worst typist. Okay. So let's go in and create the database for this. Create the database table for this. So I'm going to go into my database. Create a table. I'm going to go into design mode view. And I'm going to call it user table, because I'm pretty sure user might be a reserved word. So I'm going to call user table. I'm going to give user table ID make it an auto number. Username, make it text. Password, make it text. And full name, I'm going to make text. I'm going to make username a index field where no duplicates are allowed, and I'm going to make sure that it's required. Because everyone has to have a username. Again, you could do this a couple different ways. That's, I could almost say everything that I talk about in this class, you could do a couple different ways. But I want the key to the table to be user table ID, which is an auto number table. Because when I start stuffing things in other tables as foreign keys, I just want a simple integer. I don't want a text field to be my foreign key. But yet, I still want the person to be able to log in by putting in their name, because that seems to be a better way to do it. Okay, so I've done that. Let's go put a couple people in here. Mike and password. I strongly urge you, when you create your tables, to create a username Mike and give them a password of password. I know in general terms that's not a good security measure, all right? But it'll help me when I'm grading, all right? If I don't have to type in a 60-character password that includes question marks and exclamation points and numbers and lowercase letters and all that. So, since Doug is networking and bigger on security, I'll give him a more complicated password, ABC123. All right. So let's go in here, now that I added these, and let's write a query. And I'll do this in Access. And I'll say select star from user table where username equals question mark and password equals question mark. So I run this. It's going to ask me the value for question mark. Mike, password, returns one row. So if I give the proper credentials, it'll return one row. Same thing if I type in Doug and ABC123, gives me the one row. If, however, I type in Michael and password, I return 0 rows. Or, if I type in Mike and ABC123, I return 0 rows. So the select statement that we wrote is pretty much the select statement we want. Okay, I'm actually going to paste the code in that I have. I'll make sure that it works, and then I'll go through and explain what the code is doing, rather than typing a line at a time. So, as someone mentioned, this code is going to be on the button click event. So I'm going to create a login page. I forgot I didn't write that login page yet. So I'll create a login page. Select a master page. And it's going to have a label, a text box, a label, and another text box, and a button. This guy I'm going to change to username. And I'll call this text box username. This one I'll change to say password. Notice I'm not terribly concerned with changing the ID of the labels because I'm probably not going to write any code to manipulate them, so I don't really care. But these text boxes, I am going to write code. Now, since this is a password, I don't want to echo back the characters, so I will go under text mode, I will select password. And that way it will only allow, allow typing in it, but the results won't be echoed back. The button, the text I'm going to say login, and I'm going to double click on it, and I get into the button click event. This is where I'm going to paste in the code that I have. I have an extra curly bracket. Alright, it's looking for a label results field. That's where we're going to put in whether they successfully logged in or not. So, let's go to here, and let's put in a label field called label results. Alright, let's look at the code behind again. Select from username, or username equals that and password equals that. I'm going to add my parameters. Add a parameter. This is going to match up with my 2 question marks. First parameter fills in the first question mark. The second parameter fills in the second one. I'm going to make sure this works, and then we'll go through a quick explanation of what everything does, and we'll revisit this next time. So I'm going to set that guy as the start page. So I go and try to run this. So I type in Mike and password. I get a blow up. I get a blow up because I'm using my example from last term and I didn't use the connection string. Right. So there's no connection string called pizza connection string. What is my connection string called? I think it's called college connection string. So let's look at that. Yeah, college DB connection string. Take 2. Try to log in. User info. What did I call it? Users table. Users table, user table. User table. Told me I logged in correctly. If I type in Mike and type in wrong password, tell me it's unsuccessful. Okay, so let's look at the code. Oh look, just like before, we have a SQL data source. The only difference is instead of creating it by dragging and dropping it, we create it through our code. If you notice, we're going to do exactly the same things that we do when we drag our code and click Configure Data Source. We're going to say, hey, there's a data source. That's what this line does. We create our data source SQL object. What's the first thing we do when we configure the data source? We define what database connection to use. That's what these 2 lines do. We set 2 parameters, the provider name and the connection string. And we pull those from the web config file, looking for the connection string that has that name. Because that's what we called it in the connection string file. We do the exact same thing, right, except we picked it from a drop-down before. All right? But we do the exact same thing when we configure a data source using the GUI. We then define our select statement. Select star from user table where username equals question mark and password equals question mark. Well, that's exactly what we do. We want to fill in those 2 blanks from the user table with the values from our text box. And here's where we specify, yeah, those 2 values, they come in from the text box. So far, all we've done is we've written the code that automatically happens when we drag these things on. All right, code that exists in the framework. We're controlling it now. This part gets a little trickier because we actually have to do a query. We have to actually execute the query and look at the results. These 2 lines of code, all right, ultimately are going to create a result set, which is the results of a query that we're calling my data. All right? So my data is where our data is ending up in. This defines a simpler option for how we're going to use the data. Essentially what we get back is we get back like a table of data. The results of a SQL query is like a table of data. It has rows and columns. We are going to simply read through that from beginning to end. That's what this means. We're setting the mode that we're going to read through this. We're not going to jump around. We just want to very simplistically start at the beginning and read the data. Nothing fancy about that. So we go for the simpler option here. This actually executes the query and puts the results in an object called my data. So my data is an iData reader that's going to contain rows and columns that we pulled from the database. One of the statements in my data, in an iData reader, is the read statement. And the read statement simply points to the next row in the results set. One of 2 things can happen. There is a next row, or there isn't a next row. It's not a next row. If there is a next row, well, this is the first time we're trying to look for it. So if this returns true, that means that there is data in my data. All right? Which means what? Our login is successful. If we do this statement and it's false, all right, then what that means is no data was retrieved, which means that is an unsuccessful login. Now we'll go over especially this part of it next time in more detail, because I recognize this is trickier code. All right? It's a little bit tricky code. And we'll enhance this a little bit as well to add a few more things. Because we don't want to have to log in on every single page we go to. Right? We want to log in and stay logged in for a certain amount of time. So we'll revisit this code next time and try to increase our understanding of it. And then we'll continue on. Any questions? All right, I'll go unlock the lab. I'll be back to grab my files, and then I'll be back in lab.